They auctioned her off like livestock in front of a laughing crowd. But the mountain man who claimed her wasn't looking for a servant. He was looking for salvation. What happens when a woman society throws away becomes the only thing standing between life and death on a frozen mountain? When the joke becomes a miracle? When the unwanted becomes irreplaceable? This is that story. Stay with me until the end. You won't believe where this goes. And when you finish, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world. Now, let me take you to Red Flint Crossing, where everything began with shame. The courthouse stank of tobacco, sweat, and cruelty. Mara Ellison stood in the center of the room with her wrists bound in front of her, her head bowed so low her chin nearly touched her chest. She was 23 years old, built broad and tall like her father had been, with shoulders that had always drawn mockery and a frame that had never fit the delicate mold the world expected of women. Her dark hair hung in a loose, tangled braid down her back. Her dress, the only one she owned that wasn't patched beyond recognition, was too tight across the shoulders and too short at the ankles, and she knew how ridiculous she must look standing there like some oversized child dragged before a magistrate. Around her, the room buzzed with laughter. Red Flint Crossing was a frontier town carved out of the Wyoming wilderness with violence and vice, and its people had learned to take their entertainment where they could find it. Today, that entertainment was her. Quiet down, quiet down! Judge Amos Pritchard banged his gavel against the bench, though the grin splitting his weathered face suggested he was enjoying this just as much as the crowd. He was a thick-necked man with a gray beard stained yellow from chewing tobacco, and he leaned back in his chair like a king presiding over a circus. Now, as I was saying before you all started hootin' and hollerin', this here is Mara Ellison, ward of the late Curtis Ellison. May he rot in whatever hole he drunk himself into. More laughter. Mara's fingers tightened around each other until her knuckles went white. Curtis owed money all over this town, Pritchard continued, flipping through a stack of papers with exaggerated disinterest. And since he had the decency to die without paying any of it back, the debt falls to his only kin. That'd be you, sweetheart. He jabbed a finger in Mara's direction. She didn't look up. Now, Pritchard said, raising his voice over the murmurs, the amount owed is $247. I'm guessing you don't have that kind of money, do you, girl? Mara shook her head once, a tiny, humiliated gesture. Speak up, someone shouted from the back. She can't talk, another voice called. She's a mute. That wasn't true. Mara could speak. She simply chose not to because every time she had tried in the past, the world had punished her for it. Her voice was too low, too rough, too unfeminine. It startled people, made them uncomfortable. So she had learned to stay silent, and silence had become her armor. But here, in this room, even silence was being used against her. Well, mute or not, the debt stands, Pritchard said. And since you can't pay it, we're going to settle this the old-fashioned way. He leaned forward, his grin widening. Any man in this room willing to take responsibility for Miss Ellison here can have her. Free of charge. All you got to do is assume the debt, and she's yours. The room erupted. Take her where? Someone yelled. To the barn? She'd probably eat you out of house and home. I ain't got a wagon big enough to haul her. The laughter rolled over Mara in waves, each peal of it driving her further into herself. She wanted to disappear, wanted to sink through the floorboards and vanish into the earth. Her throat tightened, and she bit down hard on the inside of her cheek to keep the tears from spilling over. This was her life. This was all it had ever been. Her parents had died when she was 12, her mother from fever, her father from a logging accident that left him crushed beneath a tree he himself had felled. After that, she'd been passed to her father's half-brother Curtis, a man who had looked at her not as a niece but as an inconvenience. Curtis drank, gambled, and vanished for days at a time, leaving Mara to fend for herself in a shack on the edge of town. She cooked. She cleaned. She tried to make herself small, though her body refused to cooperate. And when Curtis finally drank himself to death 3 weeks ago, she thought, foolishly, that maybe she'd be free. Instead, she'd been dragged here. Come on now, Pritchard called, spreading his arms wide like a carnival barker. Somebody's got to want her. She's strong as an ox. Look at the size of her. She could plow a field, haul firewood, probably birth a dozen children without breaking a sweat. Who'd want to father 'em? A voice shouted, and the room dissolved into laughter again. Mara's vision blurred. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The walls seemed to be closing in, the laughter growing louder and louder until it was all she could hear, all she could feel, a mocking roar that drowned out everything else. She was nothing. She had always been nothing. And now, standing here in front of this room full of people who saw her as a joke, a burden, a thing to be discarded, she knew with absolute certainty that her life was over. No one was going to take her. No one wanted her. And when this was done, Pritchard would probably throw her in a workhouse or sell her off to some traveling labor crew, and she would spend the rest of her days breaking her back for strangers who saw her as nothing more than a beast of burden. That was her future. That was all she had left. "Going once," Pritchard called, his voice dripping with mock solemnity. Silence. "Going twice." Mara closed her eyes. "And I'll take her." The voice came from the back of the room, low and rough as stone grinding against stone. It cut through the laughter like a blade, and the entire courthouse went silent. Mara's eyes snapped open, chairs scraped, heads turned. A wave of whispers rippled through the crowd as a man rose from the very last bench where he'd been sitting in shadow, unnoticed until now. He was tall, taller than any man Mara had ever seen, with shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the doorway behind him. He wore a heavy coat made of bearskin, its edges frayed and stained, and his boots were caked with mud and old snow. His hair was dark, streaked with silver, and hung past his shoulders in a tangled mane. His face was hard, all sharp angles and deep lines, with a scar cutting down from his left temple to his jaw. His eyes were pale, cold as river ice, and when they locked onto Mara, she felt something shift in her chest, something she couldn't name. He looked like a man carved out of the mountains themselves. "Gideon Vale," someone whispered, and the name passed through the room like a curse. Mara had heard of him. Everyone in Red Flint Crossing had. Gideon Vale, the mountain man who lived alone in the high country, who came down once or twice a year to trade furs and buy supplies, and then vanished back into the wilderness. There were stories about him, wild, dark stories. Some said he'd killed a dozen men. Others said he'd been a soldier once, before the war broke him. Still others claimed he wasn't entirely human, that he'd lived in the mountains so long he'd become something else, something older and colder and far more dangerous. Mara didn't know what was true, but she knew, standing there in that silent courthouse, that every man in the room was afraid of him. Gideon walked forward slowly, his boots thudding against the floorboards. The crowd parted for him without a word, people pressing themselves back against the walls as if proximity alone might be deadly. He moved with the deliberate, unhurried gait of a predator, and when he reached the front of the room, he stopped directly in front of Judge Pritchard. "You'll take her?" Pritchard said, his voice stripped of its earlier bravado. "I will." "And the debt?" "I'll pay it." Pritchard blinked. You'll pay the full amount?" Gideon reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. He set it on the bench with a heavy thunk, and when Pritchard opened it, his eyes went wide. Inside were gold coins, more than enough to cover Curtis Ellison's debt twice over. That's more than... Keep the rest," Gideon said flatly. "I don't want to hear about this again." Pritchard stared at him, then at the pouch, then back at him. "Well, I suppose that settles it then." He banged his gavel once, weakly. "The debt is paid. Miss Ellison is your responsibility now." Gideon nodded once, then turned to Mara. She was still standing there, frozen, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. This man, this stranger, had just bought her, had claimed her, and she didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified. He stepped closer and she forced herself not to flinch. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice quiet now, meant only for her. She nodded. "Then come on." He turned and walked toward the door, and after a moment of stunned hesitation, Mara followed. The crowd remained silent as they passed. No one laughed, no one spoke. They just watched, wide-eyed and wary, as Gideon Vale led Mara Ellison out of the courthouse and into the cold morning light. Outside, the air was sharp and clean, a relief after the suffocating heat of the courthouse. Mara stood on the steps, blinking against the brightness, her bound wrists still held awkwardly in front of her. Gideon stopped a few paces ahead, then glanced back at her. His gaze dropped to her wrists. "Who tied you?" he asked. Mara hesitated, then nodded toward the courthouse. Gideon's jaw tightened. He pulled a knife from his belt, a long, wicked-looking blade, and stepped toward her. Mara's breath caught, but he didn't touch her. He simply slipped the blade between her wrists and sliced through the rope with a single, clean motion. The bindings fell away. Mara stared down at her freed hands, her skin red and raw where the rope had bitten into her flesh. "You all right?" Gideon asked. She nodded quickly, rubbing her wrists. He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded toward the end of the street. "I've got a wagon. We're leaving now." Mara glanced back at the courthouse, then at the town beyond it, the only place she'd ever known. It had never been kind to her, had never given her anything but pain and shame, and yet leaving it behind felt like stepping off the edge of the world into the unknown. But what choice did she have? She followed Gideon to the wagon, a sturdy, weathered thing hitched to two massive draft horses. He climbed up onto the bench and waited as she climbed up beside him, her movements awkward and uncertain. He didn't speak, didn't explain. He simply took up the reins and urged the horses forward, and the wagon rolled out of Red Flint Crossing without ceremony or farewell. Mara sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her heart pounding. She didn't know where he was taking her, didn't know what he wanted from her, didn't know if she had just traded one kind of captivity for another. But as the town disappeared behind them and the mountains rose ahead, cold and vast and indifferent, she made herself a silent promise. She would survive this. Whatever came next, she would survive. They traveled in silence for hours. The road climbed steadily upward, winding through dense forests of pine and aspen, the trees pressing in close on either side. The air grew colder with every mile, and Mara pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it did little to ward off the chill. Gideon didn't seem to notice the cold. He sat beside her, his hands steady on the reins, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. He didn't speak, didn't look at her. He simply drove, his presence a solid, impenetrable wall. Mara didn't try to break the silence. She didn't know what to say, and even if she did, she doubted her voice would come. So she sat and watched the wilderness unfold around them, vast and untamed, and tried not to think about what waited at the end of this journey. The sun was sinking toward the horizon when Gideon finally pulled the wagon to a stop beside a narrow creek. He climbed down without a word, unhitched the horses, and led them to the water. Mara remained where she was, unsure whether she was supposed to follow. "You can get down if you want," Gideon called over his shoulder. She climbed down carefully, her legs stiff from the long ride. The ground was uneven, covered in pine needles and scattered rocks, and she had to steady herself against the wagon to keep from stumbling. Gideon was crouched by the creek, filling a canteen. He glanced up at her, then nodded toward a flat rock a few feet away. "Sit. We'll rest here for a bit." Mara sat. Gideon finished with the horses, then pulled a bundle from the back of the wagon. He unwrapped it to reveal bread, dried meat, and a wedge of cheese. He broke off a portion of each and handed it to Mara. She stared at the food, then at him. "Eat," he said simply. She did. The bread was hard, the meat tough, but it was the first real meal she'd had in days, and she ate slowly, savoring every bite. Gideon ate in silence, his gaze distant. When he finished, he stood and walked to the edge of the creek, staring out at the water as the last light faded from the sky. Mara watched him, trying to understand. He had paid a fortune for her, had taken her without question, and yet he hadn't touched her, hadn't demanded anything, hadn't even asked her name. Why? What did he want? As if sensing her thoughts, Gideon spoke without turning around. "You don't have to be afraid of me," he said quietly. Mara's breath caught. "I'm not going to hurt you," he continued, "and I'm not going to use you. That's not why I took you out of there." He paused, his shoulders rising and falling with a slow breath. "I just couldn't leave you in that room." Mara stared at his back, her chest tight. "When we get to the cabin," he said, "you'll have work. Cooking, cleaning, mending. I'll need help with the land when spring comes, but that's all. You'll have your own space, your own life. I won't ask for more than that. He turned to face her then, and in the fading light his pale eyes seemed softer somehow. "You've been treated like property long enough," he said. "I won't do the same." Mara's throat tightened, and for the first time in years she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Not from shame, but from something else. Something she didn't have a name for. She wanted to speak. Wanted to thank him, to tell him she understood, to ask him why he had done this. But the words wouldn't come. So she simply nodded, slow and deliberate, and hoped he understood. Gideon held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded back. "Get some rest," he said. "We've got a long way to go tomorrow." He walked back to the wagon, pulled out a bedroll, and spread it on the ground near the fire he'd built. Then he pulled out a second bedroll and handed it to Mara. "You'll sleep there," he said, nodding toward a spot on the opposite side of the fire. "I'll be over here." Mara took the bedroll, her hands trembling slightly, and laid it out where he'd indicated. She lay down, pulling the blanket over herself, and stared up at the stars breaking through the darkening sky. Across the fire, Gideon lay on his back, one arm pillowed beneath his head, his eyes closed. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Mara felt something she had almost forgotten. Safe. The journey took 3 more days. Each day, the road grew steeper, the air thinner and colder. They climbed higher into the mountains, leaving behind the last traces of civilization, the scattered homesteads, the logging camps, the rough trails that marked the outer edges of the frontier. Here, there was nothing but wilderness, towering peaks capped with snow, deep valleys choked with pine, rivers that roared with glacial melt. Gideon drove the wagon with the confidence of a man who knew every twist and turn of the road, and Mara sat beside him, watching the world change around them. They spoke little. Gideon wasn't a man given to conversation, and Mara was content with the silence. But occasionally, he would point out landmarks, a rock formation, a distant ridge, a place where the trail forked, and explain them in his low, gravelly voice. "That's Eagle's Perch," he said on the second day, nodding toward a jagged peak. "Storm breaks there first. You see clouds gathering on that summit, you know you've got maybe an hour before it hits." Mara filed the information away, committing it to memory. On the 3rd night, they camped in a sheltered hollow, and Gideon shot a rabbit for dinner. He skinned and cleaned it with practiced efficiency, then roasted it over the fire. The smell made Mara's stomach growl, and when he handed her a portion, she ate it gratefully. "You ever been this far into the mountains?" he asked as they ate. Mara shook her head. "It's different up here," he said. "Harder. The winters are long and brutal. The summers are short. You've got to be ready for anything." He paused, chewing thoughtfully. "But it's honest. The mountain doesn't lie to you, doesn't pretend to be something it's not. It just is." Mara looked at him, and for a moment she thought she understood. The mountain was like him, hard, unforgiving, but honest. On the 4th day, they reached the cabin. It sat in a small clearing at the base of a towering ridge, surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides. The structure was simple but solid, logs chinked with moss and mud, a stone chimney rising from one end, a steep roof designed to shed snow. There was a small barn nearby, and beyond that, a corral and a shed for storing firewood. It was remote, isolated, and it was home. Gideon pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down. He stood for a moment, surveying the clearing with the air of a man checking that everything was as he'd left it. Then he turned to Mara. "Come on," he said. "I'll show you around." Mara followed him to the cabin. He pushed open the door, and she stepped inside. The interior was dim, the only light coming from the small windows on either side of the room. There was a stone fireplace along one wall, a rough-hewn table and chairs in the center, a narrow bed in one corner. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with tools, supplies, and a few battered books. Everything was functional, utilitarian, built to last. "This is the main room," Gideon said. "Kitchen, eating area, and where I sleep." He nodded toward a door on the far side of the room. "That's the back room. It's small, but it's yours. I'll bring in a bed and whatever else you need." Mara crossed to the door and opened it. The back room was indeed small, barely large enough for a bed and a trunk, but it had a window that looked out onto the forest, and it was private. It was hers. "There's a creek about 50 yards that way," Gideon continued, pointing through the window. Water's clean, good for drinking and washing. The barn's got the horses and a few chickens. There's a root cellar out back for storage. He paused, then looked at her. You'll have work, like I said, but we'll figure out the details as we go. Mara nodded. Gideon studied her for a moment, then nodded back. All right, I'll get your things from the wagon. He left, and Mara stood alone in the small room, her heart pounding. This was her new life. This was where she would live, work, and perhaps find a way to survive. She didn't know if it would be better than what she'd left behind. But as she looked out the window at the forest beyond, she thought, maybe, just maybe, it could be. The first days were strange. Mara moved through the cabin like a ghost, unsure of her place, uncertain of what was expected of her. Gideon rose before dawn, tended the animals, chopped wood, and disappeared into the forest for hours at a time. When he returned, he was quiet, his hands stained with dirt or blood, his face unreadable. Mara tried to make herself useful. She cooked simple meals, swept the floors, mended the tears in his shirts. She worked quickly and efficiently, driven by the fear that if she didn't prove her worth, he might change his mind and send her away. But Gideon never complained, never criticized. He ate what she cooked, thanked her quietly, and left her alone. And slowly, Mara began to understand something. He wasn't watching her. He wasn't judging her. He was simply letting her be. It was a strange, unfamiliar feeling. For her entire life, she had been observed, critiqued, mocked. Every action had been scrutinized, every flaw magnified. But here, in this quiet cabin in the mountains, no one cared if her dress was too tight or her voice too rough or her body too large. Gideon didn't care, and that changed everything. One evening, as she was washing dishes, she noticed him watching her from across the room, not with judgment or suspicion, but with something else, something that looked almost like respect. You're a hard worker, he said quietly. Mara paused, her hands still in the water. I mean it, he continued. You don't complain, you just do what needs to be done. That's rare. Mara felt her cheeks warm. She didn't know how to respond, so she simply nodded and returned to the dishes. But later, as she lay in her small room, staring up at the ceiling, she thought about his words. And for the first time in her life, she felt something she had never felt before. Pride. Winter came early to the mountains. The first snow fell in late October, dusting the clearing in white and turning the forest into a frozen cathedral. Gideon prepared for the cold with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything else. He stocked the root cellar, repaired the roof, split enough firewood to last through the long months ahead, and he began to make changes to the cabin. Mara noticed them slowly, one by one. A new chair appeared at the table, wider, stronger, built to hold her weight without creaking. A heavier blanket appeared on her bed, thick wool that kept out the worst of the cold. A pair of boots appeared by the door, lined with fur and sized to fit her feet. Gideon never said anything about these additions. He simply left them where she would find them and then went about his business as if nothing had changed. But Mara noticed, and she understood. He was making the cabin hers, not out of obligation, not out of pity, but because he wanted her to be comfortable. The realization struck her one morning as she sat in the new chair, wrapped in the new blanket, staring into the fire. He saw her, not as a burden, not as a joke, as a person. And that was something no one had ever done before. As the snow deepened and the days grew shorter, Mara and Gideon fell into a quiet rhythm. She cooked. He hunted. She cleaned. He repaired. She mended. He built. They worked side by side in companionable silence, each anticipating the other's needs without words. When Gideon came in from the cold, Mara had hot coffee waiting. When Mara struggled to lift a heavy pot, Gideon stepped in without being asked. They didn't talk much, but they didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full. And then, one night, everything shifted. Gideon had been working late, repairing a broken harness, and when he finally came inside, he was limping. Mara noticed immediately. She set down the shirt she was mending and stood, watching as he lowered himself into his chair with a grimace. "You're hurt," she said. And the words surprised her as much as they surprised him. It was the first time she had spoken aloud in weeks. Gideon looked up at her, his eyes widening slightly. Then he nodded. Old injury. Axe up in the cold. Mara crossed the room and knelt beside him. She gestured toward his leg, a silent question. He hesitated, then nodded. She rolled up his pant leg carefully, revealing a jagged scar that ran from his knee to his ankle. The skin around it was swollen and inflamed, and when she pressed gently, he hissed through his teeth. Mara frowned. She stood, crossed to the shelves, and began rummaging through the supplies. "What are you looking for?" Gideon asked. She didn't answer. She found what she needed, a jar of salve, a clean cloth, a length of bandage, and returned to his side. She worked quickly and efficiently, cleaning the area, applying the salve, wrapping the bandage snugly but not too tight. Her hands were steady, confident. When she finished, she sat back and looked at him. "Better?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Gideon stared at her, and for a moment she thought he might cry. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice rough. "Yeah, better." Mara nodded and stood, gathering the supplies. "Mara," Gideon said. She turned. "Thank you." She met his gaze, and in that moment something unspoken passed between them. A bond. Fragile, tentative, but real. Mara nodded once, then turned and walked back to her chair, her heart pounding. And as the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, she thought, maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. Neither of them were. The weeks that followed moved with the slow, inevitable rhythm of winter settling over the mountains. Snow fell almost daily now, blanketing the clearing in layers of white that grew deeper with each passing storm. The world beyond the cabin seemed to vanish entirely, swallowed by the endless expanse of forest and stone and sky. There was only the clearing, the cabin, the thin column of smoke rising from the chimney, a tiny island of warmth in a frozen sea. Mara woke each morning to the sound of Gideon already moving through the cabin, stoking the fire, filling the kettle, pulling on his heavy coat before heading out into the cold. She would lie in her narrow bed for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds before rising herself. The floor was always icy beneath her feet, and she had learned to dress quickly, layering on every piece of clothing she owned before emerging into the main room. Gideon would nod to her as she appeared, a brief acknowledgement, and then he would be gone, out to tend the animals, check the trap lines, split wood, haul water from the creek before it froze solid. He moved through his tasks with the steady, unhurried competence of a man who had lived this life for so long it had become instinct. Mara had her own rhythm now. She would start the coffee, set the porridge to simmer, sweep the floors, and begin whatever mending or cleaning needed doing. By the time Gideon returned, his beard crusted with ice, his coat heavy with snow, she would have breakfast waiting, hot and ready. They ate together in silence, the scrape of spoons against bowls the only sound, and then Gideon would retreat to whatever work the day demanded while Mara continued with hers. It was a simple life, a hard life, but it was not a cruel one, and that made all the difference. She had been at the cabin nearly 2 months when she first noticed the shift in how Gideon looked at her. It wasn't anything obvious, he was far too controlled for that, but there were moments, small and fleeting, when she would catch him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Not suspicion, not judgment, something softer, something that looked almost like wonder. It happened one afternoon when she was hauling a bucket of water from the creek. The path was slick with ice, and the bucket was heavy, but she had learned to brace her weight and move carefully, one step at a time. She was halfway back to the cabin when she saw Gideon standing in the doorway, his arms crossed, watching her. When she reached him, he took the bucket without a word and carried it inside. "You don't have to do that," he said as he set it down by the stove. "The water hauling, I can do it." Mara shook her head. She pointed to the stove, to the pot of stew simmering there, to the pile of mended clothes stacked neatly on the table. Then she pointed to him, to the door, to the forest beyond. He understood. "You have your work, I have mine." Gideon studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right," he said, "but if it gets to be too much, you tell me." She nodded, though they both knew she wouldn't. Telling him would require speaking, and despite the few words she'd offered that night when she'd tended his leg, silence had once again become her default. It was easier, safer. The world had taught her that her voice was unwelcome, and old lessons died hard. But Gideon never pushed. He seemed to understand that silence was not the same as emptiness, and he met her where she was, never demanding more than she could give. That night, as they sat by the fire after supper, he spoke without looking at her. "You're stronger than most men I've known," he said quietly. Mara's hand stilled on the shirt she was mending. "I mean it," he continued. "I've seen grown men half your size give up when the work got hard. But you don't. You just keep going." He paused, his gaze fixed on the flames. "I respect that." Mara's throat tightened. She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing, but she felt the words settle into her chest like warm stones, and she carried them with her when she went to bed that night. Respect. No one had ever said that to her before. The next morning, she found a new dress laid out on the chair in her room. It was simple, made of sturdy wool in a dark blue that reminded her of the sky just before dawn. The stitching was rough but functional, and when she held it up, she realized it had been made for her, cut wide enough in the shoulders, long enough in the sleeves, tailored to fit a body the world had always told her was wrong. She put it on, and for the first time in her life, a dress didn't feel like a prison. She found Gideon in the barn, mucking out the stalls. When he saw her, he straightened, leaning on his shovel. "It fit?" he asked. She nodded, running her hands over the fabric. "Good," he said. "Figured you needed something warmer. Winter's only going to get worse from here." Mara wanted to thank him, wanted to tell him what it meant to be seen, to be considered, to be cared for in this quiet, unassuming way. But the words tangled in her throat, so she did the only thing she could think of. She crossed the barn, took the shovel from his hands, and began mucking out the stall herself. Gideon blinked, surprised. Then a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You don't have to—" She shot him a look, and he stopped. "All right," he said, raising his hands in surrender. "All right." He grabbed a second shovel and joined her, and they worked side by side in the dim, cold barn. The only sounds the scrape of metal on wood and the low huffing of the horses in their stalls. It was in moments like these, small, unremarkable moments, that Mara began to understand what was happening between them. They were becoming partners, not master and servant, not owner and possession, partners, and that realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. December arrived with a vengeance. The storms grew fiercer, the wind howling through the trees like a living thing, shaking the cabin's walls and rattling the shutters. Snow fell in thick, heavy curtains, burying the clearing under drifts that reached as high as Mara's waist. The cold was brutal, the kind that seeped into your bones and refused to leave, no matter how close you sat to the fire. Gideon grew quieter during these weeks, his face drawn and tense. Mara understood why. The trap lines needed checking, the animals needed tending, and every task that had been difficult before was now nearly impossible. He would leave before dawn and return after dark, his face raw from the wind, his hands stiff and clumsy from the cold. One night, he came back later than usual, stumbling through the door with a deer slung over his shoulders. He dropped it by the hearth, then collapsed into his chair, his breath coming in harsh, ragged gasps. Mara was at his side in an instant. She knelt in front of him, her hands hovering uncertainly over his chest. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice was strained, just tired. She didn't believe him. She could see the way his hands trembled, the way his jaw was clenched tight against the pain. She stood and crossed to the shelves, pulling down the jar of salve she'd used before, along with a clean cloth and a cup. She poured him water from the kettle, then pressed the cup into his hands. "Drink," she said, her voice firm. He did, draining the cup in 3 long gulps. Then he let her take off his coat, his boots, and roll up the leg of his trousers to check the old injury. The skin around the scar was inflamed again, angry and swollen. Mara worked in silence, cleaning the wound, applying the salve, wrapping it carefully. When she finished, she sat back on her heels and looked at him. "You're pushing too hard," she said quietly. Gideon met her gaze, and for a moment she thought he might argue. But then he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Don't have much choice," he said. "The traps won't check themselves. The animals won't feed themselves. And if I don't bring in enough meat now, we won't make it through the winter." "We," Mara repeated softly. Gideon looked at her, and something flickered in his eyes. "Yeah," he said. "We." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Mara stood and moved to the deer, crouching beside it. She pulled Gideon's knife from its sheath on the table and began the work of field dressing the carcass, her hands steady and sure. She had watched her father do this 100 times as a child, and though the memory was painful, the skill remained. Gideon watched her in silence, his expression unreadable. "You know how to do that?" he asked finally. She nodded without looking up. "Where'd you learn?" She paused, then glanced at him. "My father," she said quietly, "before he died." It was the most she'd ever told him about her past, and the words felt strange on her tongue, too big and too small at the same time. Gideon nodded slowly. "He teach you anything else?" "How to survive," she said simply. Gideon's gaze softened, and he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Then he taught you well." Mara didn't respond, but she felt the words settle into her chest alongside all the others he'd given her. Strong, hard worker, survivor. She was beginning to believe him. Christmas came and went without ceremony. Mara had never cared much for the holiday. It had always been just another day in Curtis's house, marked only by his increased drinking and inevitable cruelty. But on Christmas morning, she woke to find a small package wrapped in brown paper sitting on the table beside her bed. She stared at it for a long moment, unsure whether to touch it. Finally, she picked it up and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a pair of gloves, thick, lined with rabbit fur, stitched with the same rough competence as the dress. They were warm and soft, and when she slipped them on, they fit perfectly. She carried them into the main room where Gideon was already awake, stoking the fire. "They fit?" he asked without turning around. She nodded, though he couldn't see her. Then quietly, she said, "Thank you." He glanced over his shoulder, and for a moment his expression was open, unguarded. "You're welcome." They ate breakfast together in companionable silence, and afterward, Mara pulled on her new gloves and helped Gideon clear the snow from the path to the barn. The work was hard, but the gloves kept her hands warm and she found herself smiling as she worked. It was a small thing, a simple thing, but it mattered. January was the cruelest month. The cold deepened, sinking its teeth into the mountains and refusing to let go. The sun barely rose above the ridgeline, and the night stretched long and dark. The animals huddled in the barn, the chickens stopped laying, and even the fire seemed to struggle against the relentless chill. Gideon's injury worsened. He tried to hide it, but Mara could see the way he favored his left leg, the way his jaw tightened every time he put weight on it. She began taking on more of the outdoor work, insisting, silently but firmly, that she handle the water hauling, the animal feeding, the wood splitting. At first, Gideon resisted. "You shouldn't be doing this," he said one morning as she hefted the axe and carried it toward the woodpile. "It's too much." She turned and looked at him, her expression calm but unyielding. Then she pointed at his leg. "I can still work," he said. She shook her head and pointed at the cabin. "Rest." "Mara?" She planted the axe in the chopping block with a solid thunk, then crossed her arms and stared at him. Gideon stared back, and for a moment they were locked in a silent battle of wills. Then, slowly, a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You're stubborn," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "So are you." He laughed, a low, rusty sound, like a door that hadn't been opened in years. "Fair enough," he said. He raised his hands in surrender and limped back toward the cabin. Mara watched him go, then turned back to the woodpile and began splitting logs with steady, powerful swings. That night, as they sat by the fire, Gideon spoke without preamble. "I was a soldier once," he said. Mara looked up from the sock she was darning. "Long time ago," he continued, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Before the war ended, I saw things, did things that I'm not proud of." He paused, his hands clasped loosely in his lap. "When it was over, I couldn't go back to the world. Couldn't stand the noise, the crowds, the pretending. So I came up here." He gestured vaguely at the walls around them. "Built this place. Thought I'd live out the rest of my days alone." He fell silent, and Mara waited. "I told myself I was fine with it," he said quietly. Told myself I didn't need anyone, that I was better off alone. He turned to look at her, and his pale eyes were bright in the firelight. But I was lying. Mara's hands stilled. You being here? He trailed off, shaking his head. I don't know how to say it without sounding foolish, but you've reminded me what it's like to not be alone, to have someone to care for, someone who cares back. He paused. I wanted you to know that. Mara's throat tightened, and she set down the sock. She looked at him, this hard, scarred man who had pulled her out of a room full of cruelty and given her a life she'd never thought possible, and she felt something shift deep in her chest. I was alone too, she said softly. Gideon's eyes widened slightly. She so rarely spoke that every word felt like a gift. My whole life, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I was always wrong. Too big, too quiet, too much and not enough all at once. She looked down at her hands. I thought that's all I'd ever be. And now? Gideon asked gently. She met his gaze. Now I'm not alone. The words hung in the air between them, fragile and precious. Gideon nodded slowly, and something in his expression softened. No, he said. You're not. They sat in silence after that, the fire crackling between them, and Mara thought, this is what home feels like. February brought a brief respite. The storms lessened, the sun broke through the clouds more often, and the temperature climbed just enough to make the work bearable. Gideon's leg improved with rest and Mara's careful tending, and he was able to return to the trap lines. But the peace didn't last. On the last day of February, Gideon left before dawn to check the northern trapline, a route that took him deep into the high country where the snow was deepest and the terrain most treacherous. He told Mara he'd be back by nightfall. Nightfall came and went. Mara tried not to worry. She told herself he'd been delayed, that the snow had slowed him down, that he was fine. She kept herself busy, cooking, cleaning, mending, and every few minutes she would glance toward the door, listening for the sound of his footsteps. But the cabin remained silent. By the time full dark fell, Mara's worry had turned to fear. She lit every lantern in the cabin and paced the floor, her mind racing. Gideon knew these mountains better than anyone. He wouldn't get lost. He wouldn't take unnecessary risks, unless something had gone wrong. She moved to the window and stared out into the darkness, her breath fogging the glass. The wind had picked up, rattling the shutters, and she could see snow beginning to fall again, thick, heavy flakes that blurred the edges of the world. A storm was coming. And Gideon was still out there. Mara pressed her forehead against the cold glass, her heart pounding. She thought of him lying injured somewhere, unable to move, the cold creeping into his bones. She thought of him calling for help that would never come. She couldn't just stand here. She crossed to the door, pulled on her coat, her gloves, her boots. She grabbed a lantern, a rope, and Gideon's spare axe. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was clear. She was going after him. The wind hit her the moment she stepped outside, nearly knocking her off her feet. Snow swirled around her in thick, blinding curtains, and the cold bit through her coat like knives. She could barely see 3 feet in front of her, but she forced herself forward, heading toward the trail that led north. She had no idea how she would find him. The mountains were vast, the storm disorienting, but she couldn't stay in the cabin and do nothing, not when he might be dying. She walked for what felt like hours, the lantern swinging wildly in her hand, the wind screaming in her ears. Her legs ached, her lungs burned, and the cold was so intense it felt like her skin was splitting. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. And then, just as she was beginning to think she'd made a terrible mistake, she saw it. A faint shape in the snow, darker than the surrounding white. She stumbled toward it, her heart in her throat. It was Gideon. He was lying on his side, half buried in snow, one arm outstretched as if he'd been trying to crawl. A massive tree had fallen across his legs, pinning him to the ground. "Gideon!" Mara dropped to her knees beside him, her hands frantically brushing snow from his face. His skin was pale, his lips blue, and for one terrible moment, she thought she was too late. Then his eyes opened, just a crack, and he looked at her. "Mara," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I'm here," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm here." His eyes closed again, and she knew she didn't have much time. She set down the lantern and assessed the situation. The tree was enormous, easily 2 feet in diameter, and it had him pinned from the knees down. She couldn't lift it, couldn't move it, but she could cut him free. She grabbed the axe and began chopping at the tree, her swings wild and desperate at first, then steadier as she found her rhythm. The wood was frozen, hard as stone, and every impact sent shockwaves up her arms. But she didn't stop. She chopped until her shoulders screamed, until her hands were numb, until the tree finally split with a groaning crack. She dropped the axe and shoved the broken section aside, then pulled Gideon free. He cried out in pain, and she saw that his left leg was bent at an unnatural angle, broken. She looped the rope under his arms and began dragging him through the snow, back toward the cabin. He was heavy, far heavier than the water buckets or the firewood or anything else she'd ever carried, but she didn't care. She braced her weight, dug her heels into the snow, and pulled. The storm raged around her, the wind tearing at her coat, the snow blinding her, but she kept moving, one step at a time, dragging Gideon through the darkness. She didn't know how long it took. Time had ceased to have meaning. There was only the rope, the weight, the cold, and the absolute certainty that she would not let him die. And then, impossibly, she saw the cabin. She dragged him to the door, shoved it open, and pulled him inside. The warmth hit her like a wall, and she collapsed beside him, gasping for breath. But there was no time to rest. She pulled off his coat, his boots, and carefully cut away the fabric of his trousers to expose his leg. The break was bad. She could see the bone pressing against the skin, but it hadn't pierced through. She had to set it. She found 2 sturdy branches in the woodpile and tore strips from an old blanket. Then, gritting her teeth, she grasped his leg and pulled, aligning the bone as best she could. Gideon screamed, his body arching off the floor, and tears streamed down Mara's face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." She splinted the leg, binding it tightly, then covered him with every blanket she could find. She built up the fire until the room was stifling, then sat beside him, pressing a damp cloth to his forehead. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked at her with a mixture of pain and something else, something that looked like awe. "You came for me," he whispered. "Of course I did," she said, her voice fierce. "Did you think I wouldn't?" He smiled, a weak, trembling thing. "I hoped." Mara took his hand and held it tightly. "I'm not leaving you," she said. "Not now. Not ever." Gideon's eyes closed, and his breathing evened out. Mara stayed beside him through the night, watching over him as the storm howled outside, and she made a silent vow. She would keep him alive, no matter what it took. The fever came in this night. Mara had been dozing in the chair beside Gideon's makeshift bed. She'd dragged his mattress closer to the fire so he'd stay warm. When she heard him begin to mutter, at first the words were too low to make out, just a rumbling murmur beneath his breath. But then his voice rose, sharp and panicked, and she jolted awake to find him thrashing against the blankets. "No," he was saying, his head twisting from side to side. "No, get down! Get down!" She pressed her hand to his forehead and flinched. He was burning. "Gideon," she said, keeping her voice calm even as fear clawed at her chest. "Gideon, you're safe. You're in the cabin." But he didn't hear her. His eyes were open but unseen, staring at something only he could perceive. His hands clutched at the air as if grasping for a weapon that wasn't there. "They're coming," he gasped. "Left flank, left flank." Mara had seen fever before, had watched it take her mother, turn her into someone unrecognizable in those final days. She knew how it could twist the mind, drag up old ghosts, and make them real again. And she knew that if she didn't bring the fever down, it would kill him. She moved quickly. She soaked cloths in the coldest water she could draw from the bucket, then pressed them against his forehead, his neck, his chest. She forced willow bark tea between his lips, holding his head steady when he tried to turn away. She spoke to him constantly, her voice low and soothing, telling him where he was, telling him he was safe, telling him to fight. Hours passed. The fire burned low, and she built it back up. The cloths grew warm, and she replaced them with fresh ones. Gideon's muttering shifted from battle cries to names, men Mara had never heard of, boys who had died in wars she knew nothing about. He called for his mother. He called for someone named Thomas, and once, in a voice so broken it made her chest ache, he called for her. "Mara," he whispered, his hand reaching blindly into the empty air. "I'm here," she said, catching his hand and holding it tightly. "I'm right here." His fingers closed around hers with desperate strength, and she felt him anchor himself to her, using her presence to pull himself back from whatever darkness was trying to claim him. She didn't let go. By dawn, the fever broke. Gideon's skin cooled, his breathing evened, and he fell into a deep, exhausted sleep. Mara slumped in her chair, still holding his hand, and allowed herself to cry, quiet, shaking tears of relief and exhaustion. He was alive. She had kept him alive. When she finally released his hand and stood, her body screamed in protest. Every muscle ached, her eyes felt full of sand, and her head pounded with the dull throb of too little sleep. But there was work to be done. The animals needed tending, the fire needed stoking, and Gideon needed food when he woke. She pulled on her coat and stepped outside into a world transformed. The storm had passed, leaving behind a stillness so complete it felt almost holy. Snow covered everything in thick, pristine drifts, and the sky above was a pale, crystalline blue. The sun hadn't yet cleared the ridge, but the light was already strengthening, turning the snow from gray to silver to white. Mara stood on the porch for a moment, breathing in the cold, clean air, and felt something shift inside her. She had walked into that storm certain she would die, had dragged Gideon back through the darkness with nothing but will and desperation, had fought fever and cold and her own terror, and she had won. For the first time in her life, she felt powerful. She moved through the morning chores with quiet efficiency. The chickens were huddled together in their coop, annoyed but unharmed. The horses nickered softly when she entered the barn, and she fed them, checked their water, and mucked out the stalls. She split wood until her arms trembled, then hauled it inside and stacked it by the fire. She made broth from the last of the venison, thick and rich with herbs, and set it to simmer. When she came back inside, Gideon was awake. He was propped up on one elbow, staring at his splinted leg with an expression of confusion and pain. When he heard her enter, he looked up and their eyes met. "You said it," he said, his voice hoarse. She nodded. "You dragged me back." Another nod. He stared at her for a long moment, and she saw a dozen emotions flicker across his face. Gratitude, wonder, something that looked almost like shame. Finally, he said, "I would have died out there." "I know," Mara said quietly. "You saved my life." She crossed to the stove and ladled broth into a bowl. "You saved mine first," she said, "in that courthouse, when you stood up." She brought the bowl to him and held it out. "This makes us even." Gideon took the bowl, but he didn't look away from her face. "No," he said softly. "This makes us something else entirely." Mara didn't know how to respond to that, so she simply sat down beside him and watched him eat. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm, one built entirely around Gideon's recovery. Mara became his nurse, his anchor, his lifeline. She changed his bandages, checked the splint, forced him to drink willow bark tea even when he protested. She cooked meals designed to build strength, thick stews, roasted meat, bread heavy with honey. She read to him from the few books he had, her rough voice stumbling over unfamiliar words, and he listened with his eyes closed, a faint smile on his lips. He was a terrible patient. He hated being confined to the bed, hated relying on her for everything, hated the helplessness that came with injury. More than once, she caught him trying to stand, and she would cross the room with her arms folded and stare him down until he sat back down with a muttered curse. "You're worse than a jailer," he grumbled one afternoon after she'd confiscated the crutch he'd been trying to fashion from a broken chair leg. "Good," she said, setting the makeshift crutch out of reach. "Then maybe you'll stop being a fool." He laughed despite himself, and the sound filled the cabin with warmth. But there were hard days, too. Days when the pain in his leg was so intense he couldn't hide it, when his face went gray and sweat beaded on his forehead. On those days, Mara would sit beside him and hold his hand, offering what comfort she could through touch alone. And Gideon would hold on to her like she was the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. One night, nearly 2 weeks after the accident, he woke from a nightmare shouting. Mara was beside him in an instant, her hands on his shoulders, her voice cutting through the terror. Gideon, Gideon, look at me. His eyes found hers, wild and unfocused. You're safe, she said firmly. You're in the cabin. You're safe. His breathing slowed and the wildness faded from his gaze. He reached up and touched her face, his fingers trembling against her cheek. You're real, he whispered, as if he needed to confirm it. I'm real, she said. He closed his eyes and exhaled shakily. I dream about the war sometimes, about the men I lost. And when I wake up, I think I'm back there, and everyone I care about is gone. He opened his eyes again, and they were bright with unshed tears. But you're here. I'm here, she repeated softly. Don't leave, he said, his voice breaking. Please don't leave. Mara's throat tightened. I won't, she said. I promise. She stayed beside him until he fell back asleep, and even then, she didn't move. She sat in the chair, her hand resting on his shoulder, and watched over him as the fire burned low and the night deepened around them. March arrived with the promise of spring still locked somewhere far beyond the mountains. The snow remained deep, the night stayed cold, and the world outside the cabin showed no signs of thawing. But inside, something was changing. Gideon grew stronger. His leg began to heal, the swelling reduced, and though he still couldn't put weight on it, he could sit up without assistance and move around the cabin using the crutch Mara eventually relented and helped him build properly. He started taking over small tasks, mending tools, sorting supplies, even helping with the cooking when Mara would allow it. And they talked, not constantly. Silence was still their natural state, comfortable and familiar. But the words came more easily now, flowing between them in the quiet hours by the fire. Gideon told her about his childhood, about growing up on a farm in Pennsylvania with 6 siblings and parents who worked themselves to bone and dust, trying to keep everyone fed. He told her about joining the army at 17, about the battles he'd fought and the friends he'd lost. He told her about the day he realized he couldn't go back to the life he'd left behind, how the noise and chaos of civilization felt like a cage closing around him. I came up here thinking I wanted to be alone, he said one evening, his gaze on the fire. Told myself I was done with people, done with caring, but the truth is, I was just afraid. Afraid of losing anyone else. Afraid of failing them. He glanced at her. And then you showed up, and I couldn't walk away. Why? Mara asked quietly. He was silent for a long moment, then said, Because I saw myself in you. Saw someone the world had tried to break. Someone who'd been told they didn't matter. And I thought, if I could help you, maybe I wasn't completely useless. Maybe I could still do something good. Mara's chest tightened. You did, she said. You gave me a life. No, Gideon said, shaking his head. You did that yourself. I just gave you a place to stand. She looked down at her hands, rough and calloused from work, and thought about the girl who had stood in that courthouse, certain her life was over. That girl felt like a stranger now. Mara had changed, not just in body, though months of hard labor had made her even stronger, but in spirit. She no longer shrank from the world, no longer tried to make herself small. Up here, in this wild, harsh place, she had learned that strength was not something to be ashamed of. My turn, Gideon said, pulling her from her thoughts. Tell me about your parents. Mara hesitated. She rarely spoke of them. The memories were too tangled, too painful, but she found she wanted to share them with him. My mother was gentle, she said slowly. She loved music. She'd sing while she worked, these old songs her grandmother taught her. My father was strong. Not just physically. He had this way of making you feel safe, like nothing could hurt you as long as he was there. Her voice caught. When he died, that feeling died with him. And your uncle? Gideon asked carefully. Mara's jaw tightened. Curtis wasn't family. Not really. He took me in because he thought I'd be useful, someone to cook and clean and keep his house while he drank away whatever money he had. When I got too big, too hard to control, he started looking for ways to get rid of me. She met Gideon's gaze. That courthouse was just the final step. Gideon's expression darkened. If he wasn't already dead, I'd kill him myself. The words should have shocked her. Instead, they warmed her. He doesn't matter anymore, she said. None of them do. That life is over. And this one? Gideon asked. What do you want from this life? Mara considered the question. A year ago, she wouldn't have had an answer. She'd never been allowed to want anything beyond survival. But now, I want to matter, she said finally. I want to be more than a burden or a joke. I want to build something, make something. I want... She trailed off, searching for the right words. I want to be enough. You are enough, Gideon said, his voice fierce. You're more than enough. You're... He stopped, as if the words were too big to speak. Then quietly, he said, You're everything. Mara's breath caught. She stared at him, and in his pale eyes she saw something she'd never expected to see directed at her. Reverence. The moment stretched between them, fragile and electric, and Mara felt her heart begin to race. She wanted to reach for him, to close the distance, to see where this feeling might lead. But fear held her back, fear that she had misread the moment, that she would ruin the one good thing in her life by asking for too much. So she simply smiled, a small, trembling thing, and said, You're not so bad yourself. Gideon laughed, and the tension broke, but the feeling lingered in the air between them, unspoken but undeniable. By late March, Gideon could walk short distances with the crutch, and by early April, he'd graduated to a cane. The cabin began to feel too small for both of them, not because they were at odds, but because they were too aware of each other, their movements synchronized, their glances lingering a heartbeat too long. Mara threw herself into work to distract herself. She scrubbed every surface in the cabin until it gleamed. She reorganized the shelves, mended every piece of clothing, and started planning the spring garden even though the ground was still frozen solid. And when the work inside was done, she went outside and split wood, hauled water, tended the animals with a single-minded focus that left her exhausted by nightfall. Gideon watched her with a mixture of concern and admiration. You're going to work yourself to death, he said one evening as she came inside, her face flushed and her breathing hard. I'm fine, she said, hanging up her coat. Mara, I said I'm fine. She didn't mean for the words to come out sharp, but they did, and she saw him flinch. She took a breath and forced herself to soften. I need to stay busy. Why? He asked gently. Because if I stop moving, I'll have to think. And if I think, I'll have to face what I'm feeling. And I don't know if I'm ready for that. But she didn't say any of that. She just shook her head and moved to the stove. Gideon didn't push. He simply watched her as she prepared supper, and when she set a plate in front of him, he caught her wrist gently. Thank you, he said, for everything. She looked down at his hand on her wrist, at the way his calloused fingers wrapped around her skin, and felt something warm unfurl in her chest. You're welcome, she whispered. He released her, and she turned away before he could see the color rising in her cheeks. The thaw came late that year, creeping into the mountains with reluctant slowness. The snow began to recede, revealing brown grass and patches of mud. The creek swelled with meltwater, rushing and tumbling over the rocks. The days grew longer, the sun stronger, and the world began to wake from its long winter sleep. Gideon regained his strength with the same slow inevitability as the thaw. By mid-April, he was walking without the cane, though he still limped. He began taking over the outdoor work again, insisting that Mara had done enough, that she deserved a rest. But Mara didn't want to rest. She wanted to be beside him, working alongside him the way they had all winter. So they compromised, splitting the task between them, moving through the days as partners. And as the world outside came back to life, so did something inside the cabin. They began to touch more, small, fleeting contacts that felt monumental. His hand on her shoulder as he passed behind her fingers brushing his as she handed him a cup of coffee. The accidental press of their bodies when they both reached for the same tool. Each touch was a question, each glance an answer, but neither of them spoke the words aloud. One evening in late April, as the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Gideon found Mara standing outside the cabin, staring up at the mountains. Beautiful, isn't it? He said, coming to stand beside her. It is, she agreed. I never thought I'd see anything like this. Never thought I'd live somewhere so... She trailed off, searching for the word. Wild, he offered. Free, she said. He looked at her, and she felt the weight of his gaze. "You are free, you know," he said quietly. "You don't owe me anything. If you wanted to leave—" "I don't," she said quickly, turning to face him. "I don't want to leave." "Why not?" he asked, and there was something vulnerable in his voice, something that made her brave. "Because this is home," she said. "Because you're—" She stopped, her courage faltering. "I'm what?" he pressed gently. She looked up at him, at this man who had saved her, who had given her shelter and safety, and something she was only just beginning to name. And she took a leap. "You're the first person who ever made me feel like I mattered," she said, "like I was worth something. And I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose you." Gideon's breath caught, and for a moment he just stared at her. Then, slowly, he reached out and cupped her face in his hand. "Mara," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "you're not going to lose me. I'm not going anywhere. And you—" He swallowed hard. "You matter more to me than anyone ever has. You're—" Before he could finish, a sound cut through the stillness. A low, distant rumble, like thunder rolling across the mountains. They both turned toward the northern ridge, where dark clouds were gathering, thick and ominous. "Storm coming?" Gideon said, his hand dropping from her face. Mara felt a flicker of disappointment, but she pushed it aside. "We should get the animals secured." "Yeah," he agreed. "We should." They worked quickly, bringing the horses into the barn, closing the shutters on the cabin, battening down anything that might blow away in the wind. By the time they finished, the first drops of rain were beginning to fall, fat and cold. They retreated inside, and Gideon built up the fire while Mara heated water for tea. The storm broke in earnest as darkness fell, rain lashing against the windows, wind howling through the trees, thunder cracking so loud it rattled the walls. They sat together by the fire, watching the storm rage outside. And Mara found herself leaning against Gideon's shoulder. He stiffened for a moment, then relaxed, his arm coming around her shoulders to pull her closer. "I hate storms," she admitted quietly. "Why?" "They remind me of being alone, of not having anyone." Gideon's arm tightened around her. "You're not alone anymore." "Neither are you," she said. They sat like that for a long time, wrapped in warmth and closeness, and Mara thought, this is what it feels like to be loved. She didn't say it, didn't dare. But she felt it, bone deep and certain, and she let herself hope that maybe, just maybe, he felt it too. The storm passed by morning, leaving the world washed clean and bright. Gideon woke early, as he always did, and found Mara already awake, sitting by the window and watching the sunrise. "You sleep at all?" he asked. "A little," she said. "I kept thinking about something you said last night, about me mattering." He sat down beside her. "You do." "I know," she said, and there was wonder in her voice. "I believe you. And that's new. Believing I'm worth something." Gideon reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "You are," he said firmly, "and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never forget it." Mara's heart stuttered. "The rest of your life?" He met her gaze, and there was no hesitation in his eyes. "If you'll have me, yeah." She stared at him, her mind racing. Was he saying what she thought he was saying? "Gideon, I love you," he said, the words simple and direct. "I've loved you since the day you dragged me out of that storm, maybe even before, and I don't want to spend another day pretending I don't." Mara's eyes filled with tears, and she gripped his hand tighter. "I love you too," she whispered. "I didn't know how to say it, but I do. I love you." He smiled, and it transformed his whole face, making him look younger, lighter. "Then marry me," he said, "not because of some debt or obligation, but because we choose each other, because we want to." Mara's breath caught. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, I'll marry you." Gideon pulled her into his arms, and she wrapped herself around him, holding tight. They stayed like that for a long time, the sun rising beyond the window, filling the cabin with golden light. And for the first time in her life, Mara felt whole. They didn't speak of the proposal again that day, but it hung between them like a secret promise, warm and certain. Mara moved through her tasks with a lightness she'd never felt before, catching herself smiling for no reason, her heart doing strange, fluttering things in her chest whenever she looked at Gideon. He was no better. She caught him watching her with an expression so tender it made her breath catch, and when their eyes met, he would grin like a boy caught stealing apples. The world felt different now, brighter, full of possibility. Spring advanced across the mountains with gathering momentum. The snow retreated to the highest peaks, the meadows exploded with wildflowers, and the forest came alive with birdsong. Gideon's leg continued to heal, the limp growing less pronounced with each passing day, and soon he was back to his full range of work, checking the trap lines, hunting, repairing the winter damage to the cabin and barn. Mara worked beside him, planting the garden, tending the chickens, learning the rhythms of this mountain life with a hunger that surprised her. She wanted to know everything: how to read the weather, how to track game, how to identify which plants were safe to eat and which would kill you. Gideon taught her patiently, his respect for her growing with every question she asked, every skill she mastered. "You're a natural," he said one afternoon as they worked in the garden together, their hands dark with soil. "Most people who come up here from the lowlands never adjust. They fight the mountain instead of learning from it. But you—" He shook his head in wonder. "It's like you were meant to be here." "Maybe I was," Mara said quietly, and she realized she meant it. The days lengthened. The work was hard but satisfying, and at night they would sit together by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes simply existing in companionable silence. Gideon began teaching Mara to read better, working through the handful of books he owned with patient persistence. She was a quick study, hungry for the knowledge, and he delighted in watching her face light up when she mastered a difficult passage. They didn't kiss, didn't cross that final boundary into intimacy. It was as if they both understood that what they were building was too precious to rush, that it needed time to grow roots deep enough to withstand whatever storms might come. But the wanting was there, simmering beneath the surface of every glance, every accidental touch. May arrived with unseasonable warmth, and Gideon decided it was time to make the journey down to Red Flint Crossing for supplies. They would need flour, sugar, salt, staples that couldn't be grown or hunted. He'd been putting it off, reluctant to leave the mountain now that spring had come, but they couldn't avoid it forever. "I'll be gone 3 days," he told Mara one morning as he loaded the wagon. "Maybe 4 if the road's bad. You gonna be all right here alone?" Mara nodded. She'd been alone most of her life. 3 days would be nothing. "I'll leave the rifle," he said, "just in case. And if anything feels wrong, anything at all, you get yourself into the root cellar and wait it out. Promise me." "I promise," she said. He hesitated, then stepped close and cupped her face in his hands. "I'll come back," he said. "I always come back." "I know," she said, covering his hands with her own. He leaned down and pressed his forehead to hers, and they stood like that for a long moment, breathing each other in. Then he pulled back, climbed onto the wagon, and drove away without looking back. Mara watched until he disappeared into the trees, then turned and went back into the cabin. It felt too big without him, too empty, but she pushed the loneliness aside and threw herself into work. She had plenty to keep her busy. The garden needed weeding, the chickens needed feeding, and she'd been wanting to reorganize the root cellar for weeks. The first day passed uneventfully. The second day brought rain, a gentle spring shower that made the world smell fresh and green. Mara worked inside, mending clothes and baking bread, and tried not to count the hours until Gideon's return. The third day dawned clear and beautiful, and Mara decided to check the nearest trap line, a short loop that Gideon had shown her, less than a mile from the cabin. She wasn't planning to reset any traps, just check them, make sure no animal was suffering. It was something to do, a way to feel useful. She packed a small satchel with water and dried meat, slung the rifle over her shoulder, and set out into the forest. The morning was perfect. Sunlight filtered through the new leaves in golden shafts, and the air was filled with the sound of running water and birdsong. Mara moved along the trap line with growing confidence, checking each trap in turn. Most were empty. One held a rabbit, which she dispatched quickly and added to her satchel. She was on her way back to the cabin feeling pleased with herself when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong. She froze, every sense suddenly alert. There it was again, a low, rumbling growl coming from somewhere ahead and to her left. Bear. Mara's heart began to pound. She'd seen bears from a distance, had heard Gideon talk about them with respect and caution, but she'd never encountered one up close. She knew the rules: make yourself big, make noise, back away slowly, don't run, never run. She raised her arms above her head and called out, her voice firm and loud. Hey, hey bear, get out of here! The growling stopped. Mara waited, every muscle tense, her hands gripping the rifle. Slowly, carefully, she began to back away. That's when she heard the second sound, a sharp crack, like breaking wood, followed by a crash and a roar of pain. Not a bear. A man. Mara's breath caught. She knew that voice. Gideon! She ran. She crashed through the undergrowth, the rifle bouncing against her back, branches tearing at her clothes and skin. She followed the sound of his voice. He was shouting now, cursing, and burst into a small clearing just in time to see disaster unfold. Gideon was standing at the base of a massive dead pine, looking up into its branches. The bear, a huge black bear, probably weighing 500 pounds, was clinging to the trunk about 15 feet up, trapped there by her approach. And the tree, undermined by rot and recent rain, was beginning to tilt. Gideon, move! Mara screamed. He turned, saw her, and his eyes went wide. Mara, get back! The tree fell. It came down with terrible, grinding slowness, the trunk splitting from the stump with a sound like a cannon shot. Gideon tried to run, but his bad leg betrayed him, and he stumbled. The bear leaped clear, hitting the ground and bolting into the forest. But Gideon wasn't fast enough. The tree caught him across the chest and drove him to the ground. No! Mara was running before the tree finished falling, her mind blank with terror. She reached him in seconds and dropped to her knees beside him. He was pinned from the chest down, the massive trunk crushing him into the soft earth. His face was white with shock and pain, his breathing harsh and labored. Mara? He gasped, and blood flecked his lips. I'm here, she said, her hands hovering over him, desperate and helpless. I'm here. I've got you. Can't breathe. Mara looked at the tree, and her heart sank. It was enormous, easily 3 feet in diameter, and it had him pinned so completely she couldn't even see his legs. She couldn't lift it. No one could lift it, but she had to try. She moved to the trunk and braced her hands against the rough bark. She planted her feet, bent her knees, and pulled with everything she had. The tree didn't budge. Mara, don't, Gideon wheezed. Too heavy. She ignored him and tried again, this time positioning herself differently, trying to find leverage. She pulled until her vision grayed at the edges, until her muscles screamed, until she thought her back might break. The tree shifted, just a fraction of an inch, but it shifted. That's it, Gideon whispered. That's my girl. Mara took a breath, repositioned again, and pulled. The tree shifted more, rising slightly. She could hear Gideon sucking in air, trying to fill his crushed lungs. Keep going. She pulled again, and again, and again. She lost track of time. There was only the tree, the weight, the burning in her muscles, and Gideon's labored breathing. She pulled until she couldn't pull anymore, until she collapsed beside the tree, sobbing with frustration and exhaustion. I can't, she gasped. Gideon, I can't lift it. I know, he said, his voice faint. It's okay. No, she said fiercely, pushing herself up. No, it's not okay. I'm not letting you die. She looked around wildly, her mind racing. The tree was too heavy to lift, but maybe she could lever it. She ran to the edge of the clearing and grabbed a long, thick branch that had fallen in the winter. She dragged it back to Gideon and wedged one end under the trunk, then found a rock to use as a fulcrum. What are you doing? Gideon asked. Saving you, she said grimly. She positioned the lever as best she could, then climbed onto the other end, using her full weight to push down. The trunk lifted. Not much, maybe 6 inches, but it lifted. Can you move? She shouted. Gideon tried, his face contorting with pain. Can't. Legs won't. Mara jumped off the lever and the tree crashed back down. She wanted to scream, wanted to tear the forest apart with her bare hands, but instead she took a breath and forced herself to think. If he couldn't pull himself out, she'd have to move the tree more. Much more. She looked at the trunk, at the way it was resting on the uneven ground. and suddenly she understood. She couldn't lift the entire tree, but if she could roll it, if she could get it to tip to one side, she might be able to move it enough. She ran back to the pile of fallen branches and grabbed the 3 longest, thickest ones she could find. She dragged them back and wedged them under the trunk at strategic points, creating a series of levers. "Mara, what?" "Trust me," she said. She positioned herself at the first lever and pushed down with all her strength. The trunk lifted slightly. She jumped to the second lever and pushed. The trunk lifted more, beginning to tilt. She ran to the third lever, the one positioned closest to Gideon's legs, and threw her entire body weight onto it. The trunk rolled. It was only a few inches, but it was enough. Gideon screamed as the pressure shifted, and Mara leaped over the trunk and grabbed him under the arms. "Now!" she shouted. "Move now!" She pulled, and he pushed with his arms, and together they dragged him out from under the tree just as it settled back to the ground with a heavy thud. Mara collapsed beside him, her chest heaving, her hands shaking. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just lay there in the dirt, breathing, alive. Then Gideon started to laugh. It was a weak, pained sound, but it was laughter nonetheless. "You did it," he said, turning his head to look at her. "You actually did it." Mara rolled onto her side and took stock of his injuries. His chest was bruised, his breathing shallow and uneven, and when she carefully checked his legs, she found that the left one, the same one that had been broken in the winter, was bent at a sickening angle. Broken again. Badly this time. "Can you stand?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Don't think so." Mara looked up at the sky. The sun was past its zenith, which meant it was afternoon. They were at least a mile from the cabin, maybe more, and Gideon couldn't walk. She couldn't carry him, not the whole way, but she could drag him. She'd done it before. She stood and looked around, spotting a young aspen with low-hanging branches. She pulled out Gideon's knife, he always carried it, and cut 2 long straight branches, then used her shawl and the rope from her satchel to fashion a makeshift travois. "What are you doing?" Gideon asked, his voice slurred with pain. "Getting you home," she said simply. She rolled him carefully onto the travois, then secured him with the rest of the rope. He groaned as she moved him, but he didn't scream, and she was grateful for that. She tied the front of the travois to her shoulders like a yoke, braced herself, and started to pull. The first few steps were agony. The travois was heavy, the ground uneven, and her exhausted muscles protested with every movement. But she set her jaw and kept going, one step at a time. Gideon drifted in and out of consciousness as she dragged him through the forest. Sometimes he would mutter things, her name, apologies, warnings about obstacles she'd already passed. Sometimes he would be silent, and those were the times that terrified her most. She talked to him constantly, her voice a steady stream of reassurance and determination. "Almost there. Just a little further. Stay with me, Gideon. You're going to be fine. We're going to be fine. Just hold on." The sun sank lower. Her shoulders felt like they were on fire, her legs trembling with every step. She fell twice, the travois tipping and sending Gideon sliding sideways. Both times she got back up, repositioned him, and kept going. She didn't know how long it took. Time had ceased to have meaning. There was only the weight, the path, and the absolute certainty that she would not stop until he was safe. And then, like a miracle, she saw the cabin. She dragged him the last 100 yards, up the slight rise to the clearing, and through the cabin door. She pulled the travois right up to the fire and collapsed beside it, every muscle in her body screaming. But there was no time to rest. She had to set his leg. She built up the fire until the cabin was sweltering, then heated water and gathered what supplies she had: clean cloth, the jar of salve, willow bark for tea. She cut away his trouser leg and examined the break, and her stomach turned. It was worse than the first time. Much worse. The bone had broken in at least 2 places, and one of the breaks was compound. She could see the white edge of bone pressing against the skin, threatening to break through. She'd never set a break like this. Wasn't sure she could. But she had to try. She made him drink 3 cups of willow bark tea, strong enough that he grimaced with every swallow. Then she braced herself, took hold of his leg, and pulled. Gideon's scream tore through the cabin, and Mara's vision blurred with tears. But she didn't let go. She pulled until she felt the bones align, then held them there while she frantically splinted the leg with boards and strips of cloth. By the time she finished, both of them were sobbing, Gideon from pain, Mara from exhaustion and fear. "I'm sorry," she kept saying. "I'm so sorry." "Don't," Gideon gasped. "Don't apologize. You saved my life." Again. She wrapped him in every blanket they owned, forced more willow bark tea down his throat, and then sat beside him, holding his hand while he drifted into an uneasy sleep. The fever came that night, just as it had before. But this time, Mara was ready. She fought it with cold cloths, with medicine, with the sheer force of her will. She didn't sleep, didn't eat. She simply sat beside him and refused to let him go. 3 days passed in a blur of fever dreams and desperate care. Gideon raved, calling out to ghosts, fighting invisible enemies, and Mara stayed beside him, her voice the anchor that pulled him back every time he drifted too far. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Gideon opened his eyes, clear and focused for the first time in days, and found Mara slumped in the chair beside him, her hand still clutching his, her face gaunt with exhaustion. "Mara," he whispered. She jerked awake, her eyes flying open. When she saw him looking at her, lucid and alive, she started to cry. Great, heaving sobs that shook her entire body. "Hey," he said softly, squeezing her hand. "Hey, I'm okay. I'm here." "I thought I'd lost you," she choked out. "I thought—" "But you didn't," he said. "You wouldn't let me go. You never give up, do you?" She shook her head, wiping her eyes with her free hand. Gideon looked at her, really looked at her, and saw what the last 4 days had cost. She was pale, thin, her face lined with exhaustion and worry. She'd given everything to keep him alive. "You're the strongest person I've ever known," he said quietly. "The bravest, the most incredible. I don't deserve you." "Yes, you do," Mara said fiercely. "You deserve everything good in the world, Gideon Vale, and I'm going to make sure you get it." He smiled, a weak but genuine thing. "Then I guess I'm the luckiest man alive." She leaned down and pressed her forehead to his, and they stayed like that, breathing together, alive together. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," he said, "more than anything." The recovery was long and painful, but this time they faced it together. Mara cared for Gideon with the same fierce devotion she'd shown during the rescue, and Gideon tried, with limited success, to be a better patient. He still hated being confined to bed, still grumbled about his uselessness, but he didn't fight her as hard as he had before. "I'm starting to think you like taking care of me," he teased one afternoon as she changed his bandages. "Don't be ridiculous," she said, but there was a smile tugging at her lips. "Admit it. You enjoy bossing me around." "Maybe a little," she conceded. He caught her hand and pulled her down beside him. "Mara," he said, suddenly serious, "when I was under that tree, I thought I was going to die. And all I could think about was how much time I'd wasted, how I should have told you I loved you sooner, should have asked you to marry me properly, should have—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "I don't want to waste any more time." "What are you saying?" Mara asked softly. "I'm saying let's do it. Let's get married. As soon as I can walk again, we'll go down to Red Flint Crossing and make it official." Mara's eyes widened. "You want to go back there?" "I want the whole world to know you're my wife," he said. "I want to stand in front of that same courthouse and tell every single person who laughed at you that they were wrong, that you're not unwanted or broken or any of the things they said, that you're mine, and I'm yours, and anyone who doesn't like it can go to hell." Mara started to laugh, even as tears spilled down her cheeks. "That might be the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me." "It's the truth," Gideon said. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close despite the pain in his ribs. "Marry me, Mara. Not in secret, not in shame. Marry me proud." "Yes," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "Yes, absolutely yes." They held each other for a long time, the future spreading out before them like a promise. By late June, Gideon could walk again, though he'd carry the limp for the rest of his life. They prepared for the journey to Red Flint Crossing with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. For Mara, the thought of returning to that place brought back memories she'd rather forget. But the thought of marrying Gideon, of standing beside him and claiming her future openly, made it worth it. They loaded the wagon with furs and goods to trade, dressed in their best clothes, and set out on a bright summer morning. The journey took 3 days, and with every mile they traveled, Mara felt her anxiety grow. But Gideon seemed to sense her unease. He reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "You're not the same woman who left here," he said, "and I'll be damned if I let anyone make you feel small again." Mara squeezed his hand and nodded. He was right. She wasn't the same. That girl who had stood in the courthouse, silent and ashamed, was gone. In her place was a woman who had survived winter in the mountains, who had saved a man's life twice, who had learned what it meant to be strong. She was ready. When they rolled into Red Flint Crossing, heads turned. People stared as they passed, whispers following in their wake. Mara sat tall in the wagon seat, her chin high, her hand firmly in Gideon's. They stopped in front of the courthouse, and Gideon climbed down, then helped Mara down beside him. Judge Pritchard was standing on the steps, his eyes widening when he recognized them. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "Gideon Vale. And Miss Ellison. Didn't expect to see either of you again." It's not Miss Ellison anymore," Gideon said. "Or it won't be, after you marry us." A murmur ran through the gathered crowd. Pritchard blinked. "Marry you? You mean to tell me you two—" "That's exactly what I mean to tell you," Gideon said. "We're here to make it legal, official, so do your job." Pritchard looked at Mara, and she met his gaze steadily, unflinching. She saw the moment he understood, saw the recognition in his eyes that she was no longer the terrified girl he'd humiliated. "All right then," he said slowly. "Let's do this proper." They stood on the courthouse steps, surrounded by curious onlookers, and Judge Pritchard performed the briefest ceremony Mara had ever heard of. But when Gideon slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, one he'd traded for months ago and kept hidden until this moment, and when he leaned down and kissed her in front of everyone, Mara felt something inside her finally, completely heal. She was chosen. She was loved. She was enough. When they pulled apart, Gideon turned to the crowd and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "This woman is my wife. She's the bravest, strongest, most remarkable person I've ever known. And if any of you ever speak ill of her again, you'll answer to me." No one said a word. They left Red Flint Crossing that afternoon, the wagon loaded with supplies and their marriage certificate tucked safely in Mara's pocket. As the town disappeared behind them and the mountains rose ahead, Mara felt a sense of peace settle over her. She was going home. Not to a place of shame and suffering, but to a place of love and partnership and endless possibility. She looked at Gideon, at this man who had seen her when no one else would, and she smiled. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How far we've come," she said. "How different everything is now." "Better?" he asked. "So much better," she said. And as they rode toward the mountains together, toward the life they would build side by side, Mara knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The first year of their marriage unfolded like a story neither of them had dared to dream. They returned to the mountain cabin as husband and wife, and everything felt different, not in the big dramatic ways, but in the small, quiet moments that made up a life. The way Gideon would reach for Mara's hand across the table, the way she would wake to find him watching her sleep, his expression soft with wonder. The way they moved through their days as true partners, each anticipating the other's needs, each making space for the other to grow. Summer gave way to autumn, and they worked side by side to prepare for the coming winter. But this time, the preparation felt different. This wasn't survival, it was building a home. They expanded the garden, adding rows of winter squash and root vegetables. They repaired the barn roof and reinforced the chicken coop. They gathered and preserved food with the kind of focused intensity that came from knowing exactly what the mountain winter demanded. And at night, after the work was done, they would sit together by the fire, Mara's head resting on Gideon's shoulder, and talk about the future they were creating together. "I want to add another room," Gideon said one evening in September, his hand absently stroking her hair. "Make the cabin bigger. Give us more space." "Why?" Mara asked, though she thought she knew. "Because we're going to need it," he said simply, "for when our family grows." Mara lifted her head to look at him, and she saw the hope in his eyes, carefully guarded but unmistakable. They hadn't spoken directly about children yet, but the possibility hung between them like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. "You want children?" she asked softly. "I want a life with you," he said. "And if that life includes children, then yes. I want that too. Do you?" Mara thought about the girl she'd been, the one who had believed she'd never be wanted, never be chosen, never have the chance to build something of her own. And she thought about the woman she'd become, the one who had learned she was strong enough to face anything. "Yes," she said, "I want that." Gideon pulled her close and kissed her forehead. "Then we'll make it happen, together." By October, Mara's suspicions were confirmed. She was pregnant. She told Gideon on a crisp morning when the aspen leaves were turning gold and the air smelled of wood smoke and coming snow. She'd been gathering eggs in the chicken coop when the realization hit her, the subtle changes in her body, the persistent fatigue, the way certain smells made her stomach turn. She'd stood there in the half-light of the coop, one hand pressed to her belly, and felt a surge of joy so intense it brought tears to her eyes. When she came back to the cabin, Gideon was at the table, sharpening his knife. He looked up when she entered, and whatever he saw in her face made him set the knife down. "What is it?" he asked, standing. Mara crossed to him and took his hands, pressing them against her belly. "We're going to have a baby," she said. Gideon went very still. His eyes widened, and for a moment he just stared at her. Then a slow, brilliant smile spread across his face, transforming him entirely. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm sure," she said. He pulled her into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe. When he finally pulled back, there were tears on his face. "I never thought I'd have this," he said. "Never thought I deserved it. But you," his voice broke. "You've given me everything." "We gave it to each other," Mara said, her own tears falling freely now. They held each other in the morning light, the future stretching out before them bright with possibility, and Mara thought, this is what happiness feels like. The pregnancy was not easy. Mara's body, so strong and capable in every other way, struggled with the changes. She was sick constantly in the early months, unable to keep down more than broth and dry bread. Her back ached, her ankles swelled, and there were days when simply getting out of bed felt like climbing a mountain. But Gideon was there for every moment of it. He took over the heavier chores without being asked, brought her willow bark tea when the pain got bad, and sat with her through the worst of the morning sickness, holding her hair back and murmuring reassurances. He read to her from their small collection of books, his deep voice a constant comfort. And on the days when she felt strong enough, they would walk together through the forest, his arm around her waist, supporting her. "You don't have to do all this," she said one afternoon as he helped her into bed after a particularly difficult day. "Yes, I do," he said firmly. "You carried me when I couldn't walk. You saved my life twice. This is nothing compared to that." "It's not a competition," she said with a small smile. "I know," he said, sitting beside her. "But I want you to understand something. Taking care of you, being here for you, it's not a burden. It's a privilege. You gave me a reason to live again, Mara. Let me give you this." She reached up and cupped his face, and he leaned into her touch like a man starved for affection. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," he said. "More than I have words for." Winter came early that year, settling over the mountains with a familiar bite. But this time, Mara faced it without fear. The cabin was warm and well-stocked, the animals were healthy, and she had Gideon beside her. As her belly grew and her movements became more awkward, he adapted everything around her, raising the table so she didn't have to bend as far, building a step stool so she could reach the high shelves, even carving a special chair with extra cushioning for her back. "You're spoiling me," she said one evening as he presented her with a footstool he'd made, perfectly sized to ease the pressure on her swollen ankles. "Good," he said. "You deserve to be spoiled." In February, when the snow was deepest and the nights longest, Mara woke in the early hours to a sharp, cramping pain in her belly. She lay still for a moment, wondering if she'd imagined it, and then it came again, stronger this time, unmistakable. "Gideon?" she said quietly. He was awake instantly, years of light sleeping ingrained from his military days. "What is it?" "I think it's time," she said. He was out of bed and lighting lanterns before she could say anything else, his movements quick and efficient despite the fear she could see in his eyes. They'd prepared for this as best they could, boiled water, clean linens, supplies gathered and ready. But there was no midwife, no doctor, no one but the two of them in this remote cabin on the mountain. They would have to do this alone. The labor was long and brutal. Mara had thought she knew pain, had lived through hunger, humiliation, and the aching exhaustion of survival. But this was different. This was a pain that came in waves, building and cresting and receding only to build again, each one stronger than the last. She lost track of time, lost track of everything except the rhythm of the contractions and Gideon's voice, steady and calm, guiding her through. "You're doing so well," he kept saying. "You're so strong. Just breathe. That's it. Breathe." He never left her side. He wiped the sweat from her face, held her hand through the worst contractions, and when she screamed, he didn't flinch. He just held her tighter and told her he was there, that he wasn't going anywhere, that she could do this. Dawn was breaking when the baby finally came. A girl, small and red-faced and howling with indignation at being thrust into the cold mountain air. Gideon caught her with shaking hands, wrapped her in the clean linen they'd prepared, and placed her on Mara's chest. Mara looked down at her daughter, this tiny, perfect creature she and Gideon had made together, and felt something in her chest crack open. The baby's eyes were closed, her fists waving in the air, and when Mara touched one small hand, the fingers closed around hers with surprising strength. "She's beautiful," Gideon whispered, his voice thick with tears. "She's perfect." "She's ours," Mara said, and the word felt like a miracle. They named her Sarah, after Gideon's mother, and she became the center of their world. Those first weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feedings, of learning how to care for this tiny, demanding person who had turned their quiet cabin into something entirely new. Mara's body ached in ways she'd never imagined, and there were moments when she was so exhausted she could barely stand. But there were also moments of transcendent joy. The first time Sarah smiled, the way she would quiet when Gideon sang to her in his deep, rumbling voice. The feeling of holding her close and knowing that she was safe, wanted, loved. "I keep thinking about that courthouse," Mara said one night as she nursed Sarah by the fire. "About standing there believing my life was over." Gideon looked up from the cradle he was building. He'd started it the week Sarah was born, determined to give her something better than the wooden box lined with blankets they'd been using. "And now?" he asked. "And now I have everything I never knew I could have," she said. "A husband who loves me, a daughter, a home, a life worth living." She looked at him. "They tried to destroy me in that room, tried to make me believe I was worthless, but they were wrong. They were so wrong." Gideon set down his tools and came to sit beside her. He put his arm around her shoulders and looked down at Sarah, who was nursing contentedly, her small hand resting on Mara's breast. "They were wrong about everything," he said quietly. "You're not worthless. You're not unwanted. You're the strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever known. And our daughter is going to grow up knowing that. She's going to grow up knowing that her mother is a force of nature, someone who survived things that would have broken most people, someone who fought for what she wanted and won." Mara leaned into him, her heart full to bursting. "And her father?" "Is the luckiest man alive," Gideon said, "because he gets to spend every day with both of you." Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it a sense of renewal. Sarah was 3 months old, healthy and growing, and Mara was regaining her strength. Gideon finished the addition to the cabin, a small room with a window that looked out onto the meadow, perfect for a growing child. They planted the garden together, Sarah strapped to Mara's back in a carrier Gideon had fashioned from leather and soft cloth, and worked side by side as they had always done. One afternoon in May, as they were taking a break from the garden work, a rider appeared on the trail leading to the cabin. Mara's first instinct was alarm. They so rarely had visitors, but Gideon put a calming hand on her arm. "It's all right," he said. "I recognize him. It's Tom Brennan. Runs the general store in Red Flint Crossing. Good man." They waited as the rider approached, And when he drew close enough, Mara could see he was an older man with a weathered face and kind eyes. He tipped his hat to them both. "Gideon, Mrs. Vale," he said, and Mara felt a small thrill at being addressed so respectfully. "Sorry to intrude, but I thought you'd want to know. There's been some talk in town." "What kind of talk?" Gideon asked, his voice careful. "Good talk," Brennan said quickly. "Folks have been asking about you two, about how you're doing up here. And I wanted you to know, there's been a shift. After you came down and married, after Gideon stood up there and told everyone exactly what he thought of them, well, it got people thinking." "Thinking about what?" Mara asked. "About the way we treated you," Brennan said, looking directly at her. "About the cruelty of it. Judge Pritchard's been telling anyone who'll listen that he's ashamed of what happened in that courthouse. Says he let a mob mentality take over when he should have had more decency. And he's not the only one. There's been talk of changing some of the old laws, the ones that treat people like property when they can't pay debts." Mara stared at him, not quite believing what she was hearing. "I can't undo what was done to you," Brennan continued. "None of us can. But I wanted to come up here and tell you that people are talking and they're changing, slowly, maybe, but it's happening. And it started because of you two." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a package wrapped in brown paper. "This is from the ladies' auxiliary. Some things for the baby, and a letter from some folks in town, apologizing for what happened." He handed the package to Mara, and she took it with trembling hands. When she looked inside, she found baby clothes, soft blankets, and a carefully written letter signed by more than 30 people. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything," Brennan said. "Just know that you're not forgotten. And you're not hated. You never should have been treated the way you were, and some of us are trying to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." After Brennan left, Mara sat on the porch steps, the package in her lap, and cried. But they weren't tears of pain or shame. They were tears of vindication, of validation, of knowing that the cruelty she'd endured hadn't been acceptable, that people were finally seeing it for what it was. Gideon sat beside her and pulled her close. "You changed them," he said quietly, "by surviving, by thriving, by showing them they were wrong." "We changed them," she corrected, "together." The years that followed were good ones. Sarah grew into a bright, curious child with Gideon's pale eyes and Mara's determination. When she was 2, Mara became pregnant again, and the following spring they welcomed a son they named Daniel. The cabin grew with their family, another addition, a larger barn, a workshop where Gideon taught Daniel to work with wood and leather. Life on the mountain was never easy. The winters were still brutal, the work still demanding, and there were hardships and losses along the way. But through it all, Mara and Gideon faced everything together, their partnership growing stronger with each passing year. When Sarah was 7 and Daniel was 5, they made another trip down to Red Flint Crossing, the first since Sarah's birth. The town had changed. New buildings had gone up, the streets were better maintained, and there was a different feeling in the air. When they pulled into town, people greeted them with genuine warmth, and several stopped to admire the children and ask about life on the mountain. Judge Pritchard, now much older and walking with a cane, approached them on the main street. He looked at Mara for a long moment, and she saw genuine remorse in his eyes. "Mrs. Vale," he said, "it's good to see you. And these are your children?" "They are," Mara said, her hand resting protectively on Sarah's shoulder. "They're beautiful," he said, "and they're lucky. Lucky to have parents who clearly love them so much." He paused, then added, "I owe you an apology. What I did to you in that courthouse, the way I treated you, it was wrong. Unconscionably wrong. I've spent years regretting it, and I want you to know that I'm sorry." Mara looked at this old man who had once presided over her humiliation, and she realized something. His apology didn't change the past, didn't erase the pain or the shame, but it did confirm what she'd already come to know, that the fault had never been hers. The cruelty, the mockery, the dehumanization, all of it had been a failure of others, not a reflection of her worth. "I forgive you," she said simply, "but you should know, I'm not the same woman I was that day. I'm stronger now, happier, and nothing you did or didn't do can take that away from me." Pritchard nodded, his eyes glistening. "I can see that, and I'm glad for it." They left Red Flint Crossing the next day, the wagon loaded with supplies and gifts from the townspeople. books for the children, fabric for clothes, tools for Gideon. As they climbed back into the mountains, Sarah chattering excitedly about all the people she'd met and Daniel dozing against his father's side, Mara looked back one last time at the town that had tried to destroy her, and she smiled, because they had failed. She had won. The children grew, and the cabin filled with noise and laughter and life. Sarah turned out to have a gift for healing. She could identify plants by their leaves, knew which remedies worked for which ailments, and had her mother's steady hands and calm presence in a crisis. Daniel was quieter, more introspective, but he had a talent for craftsmanship that made Gideon beam with pride. When Mara was 35, she gave birth to their third child, another daughter they named Grace. By then, Sarah was 12 and already helping with the younger children, and Daniel was 10 and capable of handling many of the outdoor chores. The cabin had grown into a proper homestead, with multiple buildings, extensive gardens, and a thriving small farm. One evening in late summer, when Grace was nursing and the older children were already asleep, Gideon and Mara sat together on the porch they'd built onto the front of the cabin. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the air was filled with the sound of crickets and the distant rush of the creek. "Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if I hadn't stood up that day?" Gideon asked quietly. Mara considered the question. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not the way you might think. I don't wonder what would have happened if someone else had taken me or if I'd ended up in a workhouse. I wonder who I would have become if I'd never had the chance to discover my own strength." "And who did you become?" he asked. "Someone I'm proud of," she said simply. "Someone who knows her own worth. Someone who built a life she loves instead of just surviving one she hated." She looked at him. "What about you? Do you regret it? Taking on a stranger, changing your whole life?" Gideon laughed softly. "Regret? Mara, you're the best thing that ever happened to me. Before you, I was just existing, going through the motions, waiting for my life to end. But you woke me up, made me remember what it feels like to care about someone, to build something, to have a reason to face each new day." He reached over and took her hand. "I was the one who was rescued that day, not you." "We rescued each other," Mara said, squeezing his hand. "Then I guess we're even," he said with a smile. They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Grace had fallen asleep at Mara's breast, her small face peaceful and content. Mara looked down at her daughter, this third miracle, this proof that life could be endlessly generous if you were brave enough to reach for it, and felt a wave of gratitude so intense it took her breath away. "Tell me again," she said softly. "Tell me about the first time you saw me." Gideon had told her this story before, but she never tired of hearing it. He shifted slightly, his arm coming around her shoulders. "I was sitting in the back of the courthouse," he began, his voice taking on the cadence of a well-worn tale. "Didn't want to be there at all, but I needed to settle some business with Pritchard, and I was waiting for him to finish, and then they brought you in." "What did you think when you saw me?" Mara asked, though she knew the answer. "I thought you looked terrified," Gideon said, "but I also thought you looked strong, like you were holding yourself together through sheer force of will. And when they started laughing at you, when they started treating you like you weren't even human," his jaw tightened at the memory, "something in me just snapped. I couldn't sit there and watch it happen, couldn't let them destroy you like that." "So you stood up," Mara said. "So I stood up," he agreed, "and I claimed you. Not because I thought you were weak and needed saving, but because I recognized something in you that I'd lost in myself. And I thought, maybe if I could help you, maybe if I could give you a chance, maybe I could find it again too." "Did you?" she asked. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I did. You gave it back to me. Purpose, hope, love. Everything that matters." Mara leaned into him, and they sat together as the night deepened around them, 3 sleeping children in the cabin behind them, and years of shared life stretched out like a tapestry of small miracles and hard-won joys. The years continued to unfold, each one bringing its own challenges and triumphs. Sarah grew into a young woman of remarkable capability, and when she was 18, she announced her intention to return to Red Flint Crossing and open a clinic, a place where people could receive medical care regardless of their ability to pay. Mara and Gideon helped her prepare, teaching her everything they knew. And when she finally left the mountain, it was with their blessing and their pride. Daniel stayed on the homestead, building his own cabin on the far edge of the property when he was 20. He married a quiet girl from one of the neighboring valleys, and together they started their own family. Grace, the youngest, proved to be the most like her father, a natural hunter and tracker, happiest when she was out in the wilderness. Mara and Gideon grew older together, their bodies wearing the marks of hard work and mountain life, but their spirits still strong. They added grandchildren to their family, then great-grandchildren, and the homestead became a gathering place for multiple generations. On Mara's 50th birthday, the entire family gathered for a celebration. The cabin and surrounding area were filled with people, children running everywhere, multiple fires going, tables laden with food. Sarah had come up from town with her husband and 3 children. Daniel and his wife were there with their 4. Grace, still unmarried at 22, had brought a young man she was courting, a trapper from the Northern Territories. As the sun set and the celebration continued around them, Mara found herself standing on the same porch steps where Tom Brennan had delivered his message so many years ago. Gideon came to stand beside her, his hair now fully silver, his face lined with age, but his eyes still the same pale, steady gaze that had first caught her attention in that courthouse. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "How far we've come. How different my life is from what I thought it would be." "Better or worse?" he asked with a slight smile. "Immeasurably better," she said. "Sometimes I still can't believe it's real, that all of this—" She gestured at the gathered family, the homestead, the life they'd built, came from that terrible day. "That day wasn't the beginning," Gideon said thoughtfully. "It was a turning point. But the real beginning was what came after, when we chose each other, when we decided to build something together instead of just surviving separately." Mara turned to look at him fully. This man who had loved her when the world told her she was unlovable, who had seen her strength when everyone else saw only sighs and silence, who had given her not just a home, but a life. "I would choose you again," she said. "Every single time, I would choose you." "And I would choose you," he said, cupping her face in his weathered hands. "Not because I had to, not because of duty or obligation, but because loving you is the best thing I ever did." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, and around them their family cheered and whistled good-naturedly. When they pulled apart, Mara was smiling through tears. "Happy birthday, my love," Gideon said. "Happy life," she replied. As the celebration continued into the night, Mara found herself thinking about the girl she'd been, the one who had stood in that courthouse certain that her life was ending, that she had no value, no future, no hope. If she could go back and speak to that girl, she would tell her so many things. She would tell her that strength comes in many forms, and that the body she'd been taught to be ashamed of would save lives, build a home, and bring 3 beautiful children into the world. She would tell her that silence is not the same as weakness, and that her voice, when she finally chose to use it, would be heard and valued. She would tell her that love, real love, doesn't diminish you or demand you be smaller. It sees you fully and chooses you anyway, every single day. She would tell her that the cruelty she endured was never her fault, never her shame to carry, and that the people who tried to break her only revealed their own brokenness. But most of all, she would tell her to hold on, to survive. Because on the other side of that terrible day, there was a life beyond imagining. There was love, family, purpose, and a future so bright it would make every moment of darkness worth enduring. The girl in the courthouse had believed her story was ending, but she had been wrong. It was only beginning. Years later, when Mara was an old woman and Gideon had been gone for 2 winters, she would sit on that same porch with her great-grandchildren clustered around her feet, and she would tell them the story. Not the sanitized version, but the truth, the humiliation, the fear, the pain, and the triumph that came after. "Your great-grandfather saved me," she would tell them, "but not in the way you might think. He didn't rescue me like a prince in a fairy tale. He gave me the space and safety to save myself. He saw me when no one else would. He loved me when the world said I was unlovable. And together, we built all of this." She would gesture at the homestead, now sprawling and prosperous, home to 4 generations of their family. "So when the world tells you that you're not enough," she would say, looking each child in the eye. When people try to make you small or tell you your worth is determined by how you look or sound or fit into their narrow expectations, remember this story. Remember that the woman they laughed at in that courthouse became the foundation of this entire family. Remember that strength isn't about being what others expect. It's about knowing your own value and refusing to let anyone take it from you. The children would listen, wide-eyed and solemn, and they would carry the story forward, passing it down through the generations. And in this way, Mara's victory would become eternal, not just a personal triumph, but a legacy that would outlive her by decades, inspiring children who would never meet her to stand tall, to fight for themselves, to believe in their own worth regardless of what the world told them. In the end, the cruel joke that was meant to destroy her became the foundation of something beautiful, something lasting, something that proved beyond any doubt that love, chosen freely and given generously, could transform even the darkest moment into the brightest beginning. Mara Ellison Vale lived to be 73 years old. When she died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by family, the mountain itself seemed to mourn her passing. But her story lived on, in the children and grandchildren who carried her strength in their bones, in the homestead that stood as testament to what two people could build together, and in the hearts of everyone who heard the tale of the woman who was given away in shame and chose instead to build a life of extraordinary love. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces between the telling and the listening, her spirit smiled, because she had won, not by destroying those who hurt her, not by seeking revenge or harboring bitterness, but by living so fully, so joyfully, so completely that their cruelty became nothing more than a footnote in a story of triumph. The courthouse in Red Flint Crossing still stood, though it had been renovated and modernized over the years. But the people who lived there never forgot what had happened within its walls. They told the story to their children, and their children told their children, and it became part of the town's history, a reminder of what cruelty looks like and what redemption can be. And every time someone stood in that building and heard the tale of Mara and Gideon, they were reminded that the human capacity for love is infinitely greater than the human capacity for cruelty, and that sometimes the very moment that seems designed to destroy us is actually the doorway to everything we were always meant to become. The end of Mara's story was also its greatest truth, that she was never given away at all. She was chosen. And in choosing to love, to fight, to build, and to live with her whole heart, she had chosen herself right back. And that made all the difference.